Well, I'd like to welcome everybody today to today's CSSGJ event. The CSSGJ stands for the Centre for the Study of Social and Global Justice. And it's the second seminar event of this autumn semester. The CSSGJ is a research centre based at the University of Nottingham, and the centre holds talks and conferences given by a range of academics and activists who are broadly committed to matters of social and global justice. Today, we're really pleased to welcome Dr. Helen Yaffe. Helen Yaffe has been a lecturer in economic and social history in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Glasgow since 2018. Previously, she taught at the London School of Economics, University College London, and at Birkbeck, University of London. In 2011, she joined the Geography Department at the University of Leicester as a research associate to work with Professor Gavin Brown on the Leverhulme project, Non-Stop Against Apartheid, the Spaces of Transnational Solidarity. The project examined the history and geography of the non-stop picket maintained between 1986 and 1990 by the City of London anti-apartheid group outside the South African embassy in Trafalgar Square, opposing apartheid and calling for the release of Nelson Mandela. Helen's teaching in Glasgow focuses on Latin American and Cuban development. Her doctoral thesis, undertaken at the LSE, was adapted for publication as Che Guevara, The Economics of Revolution, Palgrave Macmillan, and it was published in 2019. This was a really pioneering work that was based on hundreds of interviews inside Cuba, and it was based on years of study inside Cuba itself. Helen's latest publication is We Are Cuba, How a Revolutionary People Have Survived in a Post-Soviet World, also published by Yale University Press, and it's also widely acclaimed. Today's event will be consist of a 45-minute talk by Helen, approximately, and then we'll follow with a 45-minute Q&A. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Helen Yaffe today, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Oliver, and to the CSSGJ for the invitation to talk. It's a great opportunity. My book is a COVID-19 book, so it was launched in February in the UK, in late February, and then published in the US in April. So all of my book launches, except one in Glasgow, got cancelled, and of course public libraries shut, and university libraries, certainly Glasgow, are hardly getting anything new in. So it is great to have the opportunity to talk about, about the book and about the content of the book. So thank you to all of you for giving up your evening to join me today. A very tense time for all sorts of medical, political and economic reasons. So I hope I can entertain you for at least 45 minutes. I'm going to share my screen now. Oliver, can you just confirm that you can see that okay? Yeah, okay, yep. Great. So let me start my stopwatch and make sure I don't go on too long. Okay, so My Heart is in Havana, that's obviously from the recently popular song that some of you will know and now be singing along with all the evening, no doubt. Why Cuba? Why did I write this book? Why did I engage with Cuba? Well, when I was aged 18, I went to live with my older sister, 2 years my senior, with no parents, and we just went to Havana, and we lived there 95 to 96, and this was the not quite the worst, but almost the worst period of what's known as the special period. The special period is the name given to this period of economic crisis which Cuba experienced following the collapse of the Soviet bloc. Cuba lost 35% more or less of its trade over a 2 to 3 year period. It lost 86% of trade and investment. So the Cuban economy was flung into a very severe economic crisis. And that was our first experience of Cuba and, let's say, of socialism. Um, Subsequent to that, I returned to Cuba many times for youth brigades and international festivals, further research, and all sorts of other events. And every time I left Cuba with a growing network of friends, family, and colleagues. As Oliver said, I did my PhD on the economic work and ideas of Che Guevara in Cuba. It was the least known aspect of one of the 20th century's best known icons, his economic work and the work as Minister of Industries, President of the National Bank, and various other roles that Che Guevara had. I had access to transcripts of internal meetings that had never been seen by outsiders, foreigners before. So it was a really exciting archival research, plus the interviews which I did with many of the people who worked closest with Che, but not in that part of his life that is well known, not in his military endeavors, not in his youth growing up, but in the difficult task of transforming Cuba from its dependent semi-colonial status to an independent nation, then integrated into the Soviet bloc. So, and then of course I went back multiple times for research for this book, We Are Cuba. There's two photos down here I took myself in 1995. The first, you see a whole family on a bike. That was quite common to see. So, you know, the Cuban oil imports dropped from some 13 million tons from the Soviet Union in 1989 or 88, and it dropped basically down to 1 million ton in 1991 and then zero. So the Cubans had a major hydrocarbon shortage, and as a result, they shifted to bicycles. 1 million bicycles were donated by China, and another 500,000 were put together, assembled in Cuba. And so this is the picture on my right, looking at the screen, is another common image from the time. It's people hitchhiking around the island. So the rule was that anyone with a state-owned car or vehicle of any description would have to stop when they saw an amarillo, a person dressed in a yellow uniform, who would then organize. This is organized collective hitchhiking, would work out who was waiting at the side of the road, wanted to go to the same destination, and people would load up. And we did that ourselves. I hitched all the way down the island, went all the way to the Sierra Maestra, and trekked up Pico Torquino, which is of course the highest mountain in the Caribbean, where the Rebel Army had its base, and all sorts of exciting stuff for an 18-year-old to do in the Caribbean without parents. So what can we say about Cuba? Well, I think we probably all know that Cuba is a country of contradictions. I love this quote from Isabel Allende. She is, or was, because she's now retired, the director of the Higher Institute of International Relations. And she said to me, Cuba is a mystery. It is true, but you have to try and understand that mystery. For 60 years, Cuba has defied expectations and flouted the rules. It is a poor country with world-leading human development indicators, a small island that mobilizes the world's largest international humanitarian assistance, and that we've seen again during the COVID-19 pandemic, a weak and dependent economy that has somehow survived quite severe economic crises and the longest, most enduring set of sanctions, state sanctions, the US blockade for 60 years. So Cuba's often referred to as anachronistic, and yet it is also extremely innovative. Formally, it's ostracized in global terms, and yet it has millions of ardent defenders around the world. Despite meeting many of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, Cuba's development strategy is not upheld as an example. So I wanted to look a little bit closer about how Cuba, how could we try and unravel and explain some of those contradictions? But to do so, we have to, in a way, take away the exceptionalism of Cuba. We have to look at Cuba as one of the 150 developing nations in the world, and locate Cuba in relation to a much broader challenge, and that is the challenge of development. We can summarize the challenge of the development in these succinct questions. How do countries develop? Is it the free market or state action decisive? And of course, we will find that different policymakers and different political interests will argue for different approaches in different periods. But if you were to set about trying to transform or develop a country, these are the questions that you face. Where can developing countries get the capital that they need to invest in infrastructure and the social welfare of their populations? And how can they get foreign capital if it can't be obtained internally? How can they get foreign capital under conditions which do not obstruct independent development or undermine sovereignty? And how can international trade be used to produce a surplus in a global economy which is marked by deteriorating terms of trade? So these are the sort of broader economic history or political economy questions. And in a sense, we can summarize by saying the post-1959 Cuban government chose state action, that is the central plan and state ownership, over the free market exchange as the lever for development. In other words, they believed that was the best option to tackle Cuba's historical development challenges. Okay, so that said, there was still a question of the nature of the Cuban Revolution. And to really determine the nature of the revolution, they have to set out by determining what are the challenges, specific challenges now that Cuba confronts. Edward Borstein was a US economist who had experience in the United States in the planning administration, and he went to Cuba shortly after the revolution and helped them to set up their new planning management, their new planning system. He said in his book on page 1, I often quote this because I think it's a great quote, that until the revolution, the central fact about the Cuban economy was its domination by American imperialism. And he sets that up. He says it's not that it was sugar plantation, it's not its dependence on trade or imports from the US. All of that could just be seen as symptoms of this key characteristic, domination by US imperialism. And that's certainly the case that for the Cuban revolutionaries of the 1950s, US imperialism was the principal explanation for the island's structural weakness. And that means that when they took power or seized the apparatus of the state, they really faced two alternatives. And, you know, those Cuba experts who I know are in the room will be well aware that there was a battle between different interests who had fought within the revolutionary forces to determine which one of these alternatives would be taken. The first was that actually they would renounce fundamental changes to be acceptable to Washington. In other words, to operate within the limits imposed by Cuba's subordination to the United States. And the second option was to pursue deep structural changes, breaking the dependent relationship and building real sovereignty. That would imply confronting US imperialism, but also confronting the allied Cuban interests. So that would refer to the Cuban capitalist class and the owners of capital in Cuba, whose position was very much established in relation to US investors and interests. So they took the decision to adopt socialism, that we know, but that decision itself implies additional restraints and complications to those I've already laid out in the more broad and general challenge of development. And then there is the question about how to build socialism. Now, we know that the commitment to the planned economy and state ownership has not changed for 60 years. If that is what you would describe as the essence of socialism, well, we know that has been a constant, but there has been a lack of consensus about how to build socialism in Cuba. And the crux of this, in my view as an economic historian, is the question is, how do you increase productivity and efficiency, which is necessary to raise the standard of living and for development, but within a socialist framework? Now, my first book, looking at Che Guevara, talks a lot about the Great Debate, which was a very open expression of the debates on this issue. It was instigated and led by Che Guevara. It's quite complex. It involves questions about the operation of the law of value, the relationship between productivity and consciousness, and so on. But the point is, while that was thrashed out, the issues at the heart of that debate were never resolved. And that explains or helps us to understand why there have been so many shifts and changes and alterations in the economic management system in Cuba, because different approaches to try and address those key problems are being adopted. So, for example, in the first 3 decades of the Cuban Revolution, so up till during the Soviet era, there were 5 different economic management systems introduced, and 3 distinct approaches at least can be pinpointed in the post-Soviet period. Some people would probably identify more. What's the difference between all of these? Well, essentially each one reframed the relationship between market mechanisms, so that's things like competition, credit, things like individual self-interest as levers to get people to and incentives, between market mechanisms and the state plan. And that was the reframing happened in accordance with the economic and political imperatives within Cuba of that period, but also very much determined by international conditions. So in the chapter where I discuss this in the book, I focus on the period which begins from the mid-1980s, known as rectification. The long, cumbersome title for this is Rectification of Negative Errors and Tendencies. And this is a period, it's very much protagonized by Fidel Castro. He starts to criticize some of the things that are happening in Cuba, bureaucracy, corruption, inefficiency, and so on. And Cuba enters this process of rectification to quite overtly and consciously pull the country away from the Soviet economic and planning model, which has been operating in Cuba since the mid-1970s. And Cuba then forges its own path. It's a key moment for Cuba. I would argue, goes a long way to helping us understand why Cuba was not the next domino to fall when the Soviet bloc countries, not just the Soviet Union, but the other countries, Soviet republics, fell and transitioned to capitalism. Cuba had already sort of pulled itself out of that line of dominoes in a sense. And it shows Cuba's willingness to follow an independent path. And this is why, because of Fidel Castro's overt criticisms in the period, the Colombian author Gabriel Garcia Marquez said Fidel Castro is both the head of government and leader of the opposition in Cuba, which I think is, as we say at times, a very fitting quote. So Cuba pulled itself away from the Soviet Union. It survived the collapse, but it did face a severe crisis. So the next bit chapter I go on and talk about is how Cuba survived the crisis. Now, what's interesting is in summer 1989, Fidel Castro already gave a warning to the Cuban population that the Soviet Union might be close to disintegrating. If we were to wake up and learn that the USSR had disintegrated, he said, the Cuban Revolution would continue struggling and resisting. And the special period was actually, although it's associated with the crisis that comes after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it actually begins 16 months before the USSR falls in response to a decision that's taken by the Soviet state to cut preferential prices and trade rates and so on, and cut exports to Cuba. It is introduced as a kind of crisis management without military confrontation. However, then becomes an enduring feature of reality. And there's a lot of debate about when did the special period end, and did it ever end, and are we re-entering a special period? But I'll leave that for the discussion. And during this period, essentially what we see is that the Cuban state restructures the economy for reinsertion into the global capitalist market, but retains the socialist framework without relinquishing the socialist framework. And so in this chapter, I go through various important issues. One, I discuss the vulnerability of the Cuban economy in 1990, why Cuba was particularly vulnerable. It had a very concentrated state ownership, concentration of trade and so on. And I also discussed the grave socio-economic impacts. There was major impacts on people's food intake. Weight loss was massive. Diseases and linked to malnutrition and stuff that hadn't been seen for decades returned. So there was really grave socio-economic impacts. But I also look at the way that both the state and community organizations were mobilized to alleviate the social crisis. This is, interestingly, a period in which there is an increase in political participation by ordinary Cubans in new local grassroots committees that are set up and so on. And there is substantial community mobilization, which is detailed in the book. So we have a period of economic reforms and restructuring. The IMF goes to Cuba and recommends that they immediately liberalize their economy. The Cubans ignore that advice, but they do carry out a set of quite significant economic reforms, which involve market liberalization, opening up to private interest on investment and so on. And part of the results of that is we see a growth in inequality and illegality. So once you have the introduction of the dual economy, there is an incentive for people to operate in the so-called black market. There is an incentive for people to operate in the with illegal activities to get access to the hard currency. But there's also a set of important agricultural changes that take place, and many of you here will be aware that this is the period when, without diesel, without petroleum, without hydrocarbons, Cuba is forced to adopt a sustainable mode of development and organic farming. And it does so very successfully, and subsequently has become a model for the world. So there are many recent scientific analysis of countries achieving sustainable development, and Cuba is invariably up there among the leaders, if not leading nations, in terms of sustainable development, which is measured, by the way, by not only reducing your carbon footprint, but also raising the standard of living of the population at the same time. Now, while I just want to point to this graph here, I think this graph is really important and says a lot about how Cuba survived the special period. So the line graph you'll see is GDP, which plummets, as I've said. The worst peak is the worst moment is 1993. But if you notice the bar graph, this is the official unemployment rate. Now, in any capitalist country, when you see the GDP plummeting, i.e. economic crisis, you would see unemployment go up. And what you see is in Cuba is the opposite. Unemployment goes down when they enter severe economic crisis. Why is this? This is because the state takes a decision to keep people in employment. One, so they have access to a minimum, and it is a minimum salary, so monetary income. But two, because of the political function of employment in Cuba, there is an attempt to mobilize all Cubans to get them involved in political activity and community activity, and the role that the workplace has for Cuba is a central part of that. So, Cuban political participation through work, but also it is a means of delivering people with free lunches to make sure that they have access to some nutrients and so on. So the decision is taken, but this creates the cycle of low productivity and low salaries, which prevails, which the Cuban government has been trying to tackle since 2011. So you can see just at the end of this chart that we have quite a swift recovery. I mean, it's, you know, obviously not making up the lost ground, but there is a swift recovery. And one of the features of this special period in terms of the social demographic feature is quite significant migration, illegal migration, dangerous migration. And that leads us on to talk about Elian Gonzalez. So Elian's, most of you will have heard of Elian, or all of you, I suspect. Elian Gonzalez was the small Cuban boy who, 5 years old, was taken by his mother to on a raft, a very dodgy boat, to illegal immigration to go to the United States, where Cubans arriving have permanent residence, and then within 1 year citizenship. So there's a great pull factor there. Now, Elian Gonzalez was taken without his father's knowledge or permission by his mother. They were separated, and as a consequence, when he gets to Miami, or rather he gets to the United States, and his mum has died and her partner, and most of the people on the raft have died. There's only 3 survivors, and he's taken into the care of his father's family in Miami, and it becomes a huge political battle. I probably don't need to tell you any of this, because I'm quite sure you're well aware. Anyway, the point is that there is a major mobilization nationally and internationally to get Elian Gonzalez returned to his father in Cuba. And the impact that this had on Cuba was it grew into something called the Battle of Ideas. It's very interesting how that happened. They were battling for Elian, and apparently Fidel Castro called around a group of youth leaders, and he said, you know, we need to find out what is happening in our barrios and in Cuban homes. Why are people risking the lives of their small children to make this perilous trip? What exactly is going on? So they started to investigate, first of all, in Havana, what was the situation of teenagers. This followed on from a study that had taken place the previous year to investigate the backgrounds, educational levels, racial backgrounds, and so on of young people in prisons. So essentially, this turns into a sort of redemptive battle of ideas that involves the whole nation. And the context is really key, because this is happening from, well, 99 is the Elian, the start of 2000, it's the Battle of Ideas, full swing. This is the context of the Bush Jr. administration, the era of wars and occupation. So, you know, Iraq is invaded, first Afghanistan is invaded and occupied, and then Iraq. And in between those two things, Cuba is put in the sight hairs of the rifle, in a sense, by the accusation that it is developing biological weapons, which is a response to developments in its biotech sector and so on. In general, there is a growing hostility from the United States under the Bush administration. So the battle of ideas sees Fidel Castro back in the front way, a very anti-imperialist rhetoric, very combative rhetoric. It's an effort to reinforce anti-imperialist and socialist principles among a population which is moving from just resisting the crisis into insisting, you know, that Elian is returned. So it's coming out of the special period. It plays a very important role in getting the Cuban people to change gear. But this is also a campaign that's possible because of the material improvements that I was pointing out. It's just happening as the relationship with Chavez in Venezuela is starting and the first accords are being signed there. The fact that there has been some material improvement, that the danger of economic collapse under the special period is past, means that the Cuban government has some resources it can now invest in trying to address the material deprivation and the austerity that the Cuban people have been through in the 1990s. And so the battle of ideas leads to extremely ambitious socio-economic and education programs which see youth as the principal protagonists and beneficiaries. I'll give you an example of perhaps the most ambitious, one of the last projects under the Battle of Ideas, and that what involved surveying the entire population of 15-year-olds and under to look at their biopsychosocial situation, and that involved 2 million Cubans. So wherever there were issues identified, maybe they're underweight, that's the first sign, then they would have a team investigating their domestic situation, their situation at home, and they also were directing resources to try and resolve problems that emerged. If it emerged that both parents were unemployed, they would try and help people to get into work. So this was a period, and you can see the photo here, these young people, most of them non-white, in red t-shirts saying they're trabajadores sociales, they're social workers. These were young people who had formerly been out of employment and out of education, the disconnected youth as they were known, and they were enrolled into these huge big sorts of social movements as social workers, working in their own communities, finding out what people's problems were, and with a big effort to deal with scarcities and problems, deficiencies in the schools sector. They were enrolled as emergency teachers, and I discussed some of the issues that arise with these campaigns, and you know, what it means for those young people, the kind of training they went through, and so on. Okay, so as the battle of ideas develops into some of the education programs, it dovetails then, or it emerges into the energy revolution, which is, as I say, power to the people. Luis Perez is the president of an NGO, Cuba Solar. He said to me, I think this is a great quote as well, and energy is an instrument of power. What did the United States do when it broke off relations with Cuba? Take away our oil supply. What did the USSR do? Give us oil. So what I found really interesting when I started the research for this chapter was how early Cuban scientists had actually been looking into developing renewable energies, and that work began from the late 1980s. But most of it remained at the stage of experimentation, because clearly with the cheap or underworld price Soviet oil imports in abundance, there was no incentives for Cuba to carry out this transition. There was also a lack of the technology that is necessary. But around this time, Cuba has an energy revolution, partly, again, out of necessity. The special period had seen Cuba's experience for many years blackout, so that all of your electricity goes, and not just the lights, obviously, fridges, air fans, everything. And those would last sometimes 12 hours or more or less, and be frequent. They were rationed blackouts. But what happened in the early 2000s is blackouts returned to Cuba, but they weren't rationed. They were more to do with problems in the old equipment. They couldn't get repairs. There was all sorts of failings of these big old Soviet power stations. So the response to this was the major state initiative known as the Energy Revolution, to both improve energy security and energy efficiency. The other point that was made to me by Luis Perez, and this links to the fact that this was the Bush era, is, you know, if they were dependent on 7 big old Soviet power stations, as he said to me, you know, with 7 bombs, Bush could take out the whole of Cuba. What they did then was to import to Cuba something like 2,000 much smaller, more efficient energy generators, which were distributed around the country in a distributed system. They became the second most distributed system in the world at that point. And this is also a system that's very useful for a transition to a future transition to renewable energies, because the distributed power generators allow local renewable energy production and distribution. They also introduced a progressive electricity tariff. This was significant in a country where, you know, everything's been subsidized universally and so on, although that's began to change with the battle of ideas. And an incredible campaign to replace old durable goods was underway. So that is fridges, televisions, cooking materials. You see there the picture of Fidel Castro. He's admiring one of the new pressure cookers that was imported mainly from China and distributed to all families at subsidized rates that they could pay in installments. However, energy saving light bulbs were given to everyone free, and within 6 months, Cuba became the first country in the world to complete the switch to all energy saving light bulbs. And those were carried to every Cuban home by the social workers with the red t-shirts in their backpacks. So we also see that this is the link between the Energy Revolution and Battle of Ideas. The Battle of Ideas took televised teaching to mounted schools, and the Energy Revolution took the solar panels that were needed to power that. Now, today, it's worth saying there is a major state initiative to shift the energy mix significantly towards renewable energies. Cuba is still a very small proportion of its energy comes from renewables. The state will is there, the scientific knowledge is there. The major obstacle is that they require foreign investment, foreign technology, and that, of course, is blocked by the United States blockade. Okay, so I'm aware that I've got about 13 minutes left, so if I start speeding up, that's why. The other really important development that couldn't really write about how Cuba has survived by ignoring this sector, and that is Cuba's medical science sector. So this chapter is about the curious case of Cuba's biotech revolution. Why curious? Because in some aspects it has been world leading, and yet it is almost completely distinct from other biotech sectors in the world, and developed extremely early. Dr. Augustin Laje was one of the sort of founding scientists of the sector. He is at the Center for Molecular Immunology. They are the people who have developed the first lung cancer immunotherapy, or cancer immunotherapies more generally, because they're working on others. I interviewed him, and he explained that this was the first time in its economic history that Cuba has incorporated itself into an emerging industrial sector. So the first ever biotech company in the world was set up in 1976 in the United States, and the second was set up in 1980. Just 1 year later, also in the United States, just 1 year later, Cuba founds the Biological Front. So essentially, that was the first institution to found the biotech sector in Cuba. It's very much, again, expression of the political will of Fidel Castro. He's behind this the whole way. He's insisting, carving out the space and the investment that this sector needs. And despite the crisis that I've just talked about of the special period, in the 1990s, the biotech institutions which were just being established saw major investments, where most other sectors saw major cuts. Of course, why is this so important? Why is Fidel Castro so focused on this? We have to remember that the US blockade includes medicine and equipment. Now, before the revolution, most of Cuba's medicine is provided by 3 big US pharmaceutical companies. After the revolution blockade is implemented, that they no longer have access to that. But they have the Soviet bloc, so medicines can be purchased from there. What happens in the 1990s, and I saw it for myself, I'm sure many of you did, is pharmaceutical shelves are just empty, just covered in dust. So major investments go into also the pharma industry in Cuba to produce generic drugs and just to get domestic production up. What is distinctive about the sector? It is 100% state-owned. So I've done some work on how the biotech sector functions and was set up in the capitalist country, and that's very different. It's not that there's not state money in the US biotech sector. There is. It's pumped in through the National Institutes of Health, pumped into universities. The benefits and the profits are accrued by private interests. In Cuba, there is no profit sought domestically. The different institutions that exist, and there are multiple, actually cooperate, seeking synergy over competition. So they sit down, say, once a month, the directors of all the institutes in what's known as the scientific pole, which is an area in Western Havana, and they discuss what they're working on, what problems they're trying to resolve, and maybe how they can help to do that. And some of the major products of the biotech sector have been collaborations between different institutes, so we can see that this works. The biopharma, the biotech sector in Cuba is also completely integrated into the public health system. This means there can be a very quick move from laboratory to public healthcare system, and we've seen that with the 1981 dengue outbreak and various other public health issues, and we're seeing it right now with COVID-19 pandemic, this incredible integration between biotech and public health and education. And it's driven by public health demand. So the biotech sector actually starts, really takes off with the development of interferons, which are used in Cuba. It's the first time they're ever used for sort of major mass public healthcare campaign in 1981, and that's in response to the dengue outbreak. So you now have a situation where Cuba produces some 70% of the medicines that are consumed domestically. It has nearly 200 inventions and products that are marketed in 50 countries and partnerships with global South countries. Those numbers will definitely have gone up during the COVID-19 pandemic. Cuba is now trialing 2 different vaccines for COVID-19. They work on a different sort of premise than most of the vaccines being developed around the world. Other world firsts for Cuba, world's first meningitis B vaccine, which was in 1988, and we were still being told in Britain 30 years later that there was no vaccine for meningitis B. The first lung cancer immunotherapy, first in the world to eliminate mother-to-child HIV transmission, first human vaccine with a synthetic antigen, which makes it much safer. Okay, so moving on, again, this links to the COVID issue. So, I wrote my book before COVID happened, but if there are questions in relation to Cuba's response to that, then I'm happy to discuss those. So Cuba, most of you will know, has an incredible record of sending healthcare professionals around the world. Why does it do it? I discuss in this chapter why Cuba does that, different interpretations, and essentially conclude that, revolutionary Cuba, for political reasons, promotes a global struggle against underdevelopment, colonialism, neo-colonialism, and imperialism. And they view global poverty and poor health as a result of these exploitative conditions. So in my view, that is why they were just as likely to send soldiers to fight, to join national liberation struggles, as they have been in the subsequent period, to send medics to treat underserved populations. And the phenomena of Cuban medical internationalism has taken place since 1960, when Chile had, I think someone said the other day, it was still the world's worst ever earthquake, and terrible fatalities. And despite the fact that Cuba had hardly any doctors, certainly compared to today, they sent doctors over to Cuba to provide some emergency aid. And then you get to, these programs continue. The first time they helped to set up a public health system rather than do emergency treatment was in Algeria, 1963, with the newly independent government there. And they have multiple different forms of programs, and I go through all of those and how they've developed and give some examples. But you get this astonishing fact that, and this is again before COVID-19, some 400,000 Cuban medical professionals have worked overseas in 164 countries. By 2014, they had done 1.2 billion consultations, attended 2.2 million births and 8 million surgeries. So we're talking about millions of lives improved or saved by Cuban medical professionals. And in addition to this, tens of thousands of foreigners have gone to Cuba either as patients or to study medicine in Cuba. So 2 quite astonishing examples. I mean, I find it incredible that in the 30th anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster, almost nothing was said about the fact that a few years after Chernobyl, the Cubans started what was called the Children of Chernobyl program, where they invited, it turns out to be, well, they just started inviting children who they could see were suffering the effects of radiation. And within a 21-year period, something like 26,000 people, the vast majority of them children, had received free treatment in Cuba with accommodation and everything, who were from Ukraine and surrounding areas, who were affected by the Chernobyl disaster. And Cuba never received a penny. So it did this all through the special period. While it was struggling to feed its own children, they still managed to treat the children of Chernobyl in an incredible program. Then at the end of 1999, let's say 2000, you have the natural disasters that take place in Central America. The Cubans send emergency doctors and are confronted by the spectacle of a lack of medical facilities, a lack of medical personnel. And the decision is taken by Fidel Castro to invite thousands of students to Cuba, to the Latin American School of Medicine. And it becomes the world's largest medical school and has now, I believe, graduated 31,000 medics. And they are no longer just from Latin America. They include students from all over Asia and Africa, and even students from the United States. And then, as I said, during the COVID-19 pandemic, at least 3,700 Cuban specialists in disease control and disaster response from the so-called Henry Reeve Brigade international contingents have treated COVID-19 patients in 40 countries. And they've done that despite the sanctions by the United States being tightened. Okay, talking of the United States, we move on to Cuba-US relations. I'm going to try and whiz through this because I see that I'm getting close to my time. I interviewed Josefina Vidal, who was the Cuban who led the Cuba's team in negotiations with the Obama administration, those secret negotiations which led to rapprochement in December 2014. History has shown, she said, that pressure, preconditions, and aggression do not work with Cuba. And I think that history certainly seems to vindicate that claim. What we have is 60 years of conflict. The balance of power has, of course, lain with the United States, but Cuba has not been a subservient neighbor. It hasn't been a respectable neighbor in the US's perspective. And you can see, for example, its role in Angola, against defending the country from the invading forces of South Africa and so on. It has taken all sorts of foreign policy actions that were against the interests of the United States. US actions have included overt and covert actions, sabotage and terrorism, the US blockade, which of course is extraterritorial. OFAC fines British companies, for example, which is actually illegal under UK law, but the British courts don't take any action, and so this carries on. So the blockade is by no means a bilateral affair, it is an international issue. The US has pressured other countries to isolate and ostracize Cuba. For example, Cuba was expelled from the Organization of American States. They've also encouraged illegal and dangerous immigration. Two examples are Operation Peter Pan, which saw thousands of young Cubans sent unaccompanied in the early 1960s to the United States after a scare campaign about what the communists were going to do with them. And the Cuban Medical Parole Program, which was introduced by the Bush administration, which encouraged Cuban medical professionals serving underserved populations around the world to basically go to their nearest US consulate or embassy and abandon the missions that they were on in return for residency in the United States. And behind all this, there has been lucrative funding for regime change programs, a basic standard level of 20 billion that is agreed yearly by Congress. And of course, this has created many vested interests. So there are many who actually have no desire to see an improvement of relations, because they live off this regime change programs and so on. And the interesting thing is, with the collapse of the Soviet bloc and apparently the end of the Cold War, actions increased in terms of aggression against Cuba in the 1990s. So there was the terrorist bombings of hotels, there was the Brothers of the Rescue flying the planes over, 2 planes got shot. That led to the signing of the Helms-Burton Act, which tightened the blockade. And we have to say, very importantly, that aggression has intensified probably to unprecedented levels under the Trump administration. And as I said before, even during the pandemic. Okay, so I'm going to whiz through this. From 2008, Raul Castro formally takes over as president and starts to introduce some reforms. The land, the handing out state land in usufruct to individual and family farmers. And then the reform process is formalised in 2011 under the guidelines for updating the economic and social system. So there's a big debate about whether this represents an embrace of capitalism. Is this a sign of Raul liberalising, opening to capitalism? Or is this, as he claims, about socialist efficiency and trying to deal with that cycle that emerged from the special period of low productivity and low salaries? So this chapter gives an account of the reforms that were introduced under Raul Castro's mandate from 2007 and frames the measures in terms of the problems they intended to address and the results achieved. Essentially, it shows that the reforms sought to improve efficiency and productivity within the socialist framework by opening a space for market mechanisms and seeking foreign capital in the form of foreign direct investment and remittances, so hence the importance of small businesses. The important point that's highlighted in this chapter as well is shown in this picture. Here's a group of young people sitting down with the draft guidelines, which was circulated to the entire population, who were then invited to debate, comment. All of their views were recorded, analysed, categorised and reported. 68% of the original guidelines were changed following the national consultation. So this process was repeated throughout Raul Castro's decade as president, the process of involving ordinary Cubans in shaping the future and securing legitimacy and acceptance for the changes underhead. But of course, this increased the contradictions within Cuban political economy. Market exchanges, private accumulation, the emergence of exploitative social relations, because if you allow an individual to employ others in a private relationship in Marxist terms and according to the Cuban Constitution, that is an exploitative social relation. So it also leads to greater inequality and who has access to dollars and so on, and it sparks an internal debate. And in this process from post 2011, Cuban social scientists and others began to criticize the economic reforms for their narrow focus on economic efficiency, they said, at the cost of social equity. And they demanded action to halt growing inequality and marginalization. And I would say that this was very much an internal debate. There was very little said about this at the time outside of Cuba. But people noticed when subsequently non-state licenses were suspended and the institutional apparatus for this non-state sector was strengthened, so the ability to audit, tax, monitor and so on. The state reinforced control over production, distribution and prices to protect the population. And this emphasises a point I've made before of the long-standing tendency to reassert the centrality of social justice in the development process, even at the cost of economic growth. So finally, this is reflecting on the last chapter, which I never intended to write, but it became very clear to me as I was writing up the manuscript that with the measures taken under the Trump administration to tighten the blockade and increase sanctions, that the question it had to be incorporated into the manuscript, and the question became whether Cuban people would survive the post-rapprochement period. A Google employee who preferred not to be named, but who is, Google is engaging with Cuba and has an exemption from the Helms-Burton Act because it's a telecoms company, and that's something that Mas Canosa built into the Helms-Burton Act. He said it's not just that there's been a reversal from the Obama administration. I think you could argue that it's worse than it was in decades. And we certainly saw a return to the kind of Cold War vocabulary and hostility under the Trump administration. The return of John Bolton talking about the tyranny of, I can't remember the term he used now. He has so many slogans. And I believe there has now been 240 new measures or new sanctions introduced under the Trump administration. And that is on top of, a country that's already been subject to a blockade for 60 years. The result has been oil, food, equipment shortages, foreign investors and trade partners have been scared off. Cuban revenues have been blocked, including from healthcare services. And most of you will know that all the Cuban medics in Brazil, Ecuador, and Bolivia were expelled or withdrawn shortly before, having a very bad impact on Cuba's revenues, but also, in terms of the result of COVID-19, it really was a detrimental move. The question became, was Cuba returning to the special period, and how would the revolutionary people survive? Well, interestingly, the apparatus that the state has could exist still. It was never removed, and it could then be used to channel resources. So the state, after going through a period where the state seemed to decentralize and decrease control, the state began to increase control over the distribution, over production and distribution, to protect the population from scarcity. So it proved that that sort of infrastructure of the socialist state became very useful. There was also a move to raise salaries and to generally search for domestic solutions. And this has taken place under a new president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, who's very much a product of the Cuban Revolution, born after the Cuban Revolution in 1960. And Diaz-Canel has overseen the introduction of a new constitution, again, the product of mass consultation and participation. This is a picture of a street committee meeting to discuss the constitution, which was approved in 2019. And that was necessary to accommodate the reforms that, as I said, violated the constitution, with allowing small businesses and so on. Okay, I had 2 slides of reflections, but I'm going to leave it there. I will just, because I've gone over my time already, I will just end with the last sentence of the book, which, having sort of summed up what Cuba's been through and what they've confronted, asks the question, what could the revolutionary people of Cuba achieve if they were left in peace, if they were finally given the chance to prosper and not just survive? And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Helen. You covered a lot of ground in that talk, and it gives us a lot of questions available while we move on to the Q&A here. I'm hoping my internet's well enough. Can you just give me an indication that it is? Because I've had a bit of a struggle over the past 5 minutes.
It's fine. It's fine for now.
So what we're going to do now is we're going to go to a Q&A. We've got two options, really. We're going to break it up into... is it working? Yeah. Okay, so we're going to break it up into two options. We're going to allow people to ask Helen questions directly. So I'm going to allow people to unmute themselves. And I'm also going to allow, after we've asked 2 questions that way, we're going to have questions via chat. But it's going to be the director, Professor Andreas Bieler, who's going to be covering the chat and asking questions that way. So if you could indicate by putting your hands up, I'm just going to quickly allow people to unmute themselves when they want to ask a question. We've got about 30 minutes for this. So yeah, if you want to indicate that you'd like to ask a question via audio, that'd be appreciated. Thank you.
Oliver, there are two questions, one by Laura Tedesco and another one by Friedrich Arnold.
Okay. Hi, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay, Helen, thank you very much for your presentation. Although I have to say I'm a bit disappointed, yeah, because it's like here somebody from the Cuban government, yeah. There was no critical analysis from your presentation, yeah. It's like here somebody just with a very descriptive, yeah, presentation about what they have done, right? But there are quite a lot of things that have not are not doing very are not going very well in Cuba, right? And they have not succeeded in many things, yeah. Agriculture, right? For instance, yeah. Or you also mentioned about the doctors. I mean, I could go on and on and on. I also travel to Cuba very often. There is a lot of poverty. There is also, and you could blame the United States, yeah, but there is also a lot of human rights violations, yeah. You didn't mention Venezuela as the partner that replaced when the Soviet Union collapsed. But what I missed really was a critical analysis. I find it very descriptive, and as a description was right, but very biased, terrible bias, yeah. And coming from somebody which I believe is from the United Kingdom, and I also think that, you know, we enjoy many liberties, yeah, many freedoms, right? And we always believe that the Cubans are okay the way they are, yeah. I'm not quite sure how many of us would be happy if the state would like to do a biopsychosocial test on our kids, yeah. I don't know, now that we are all suffering, you know, how the governments are taking so many measures, yeah, because of COVID, and we don't like it, yeah. I wonder how many of us will like to live in such a dominant state. Miguel Díaz-Canel is there, but nobody voted for him, yeah. The Castros at least have done something to be there. Canel didn't do anything. So, I mean, maybe it's not a question. It's I am disappointed because for me it was like coming to listen to somebody from the Cuban government.
Thanks for that comment, Laura. And I'm going to ask George Bracelaw. He's got his hand up now. If you'd like to ask a question, please can we keep it very brief, because we haven't got enough time. We've got lots of people here. So yeah, over to you, George.
Thank you very much. When one thinks about what was uncovered in East European socialism in the context of their last years or decade in power, it was a combination of indignation about a ruling class lording it over the population, a sense of cynicism in the younger generations that it no longer retained revolutionary enthusiasm, and in addition, a revulsion against not petty corruption, but grand corruption. And I wonder whether cynicism in the younger generations and indignation over grand corruption are realities in Cuba today.
Would you like to take any more, Helen, or are those two comments, questions okay?
Let's take a couple more, I think.
Yep. So we got Friedrich Annert. Would you like? Good to see you, mate. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, well, actually, I just had two short questions. One was, how do you think has the Cuban government done so far since the changes that affected the constitution in 2018, 2019? Has the Cuban Revolution, which has been quite, radical and ideological, until the 80s and 90s, has it become more institutionalized now with the new constitution and the presidential regime that is only there for 5 or 10 years and not for longer, and without the Castro brothers? That would be the first question. And the second question would be regarding the relationship with Venezuela. Would you think that, do you think that Venezuela is kind of following a similar path now than Cuba, a couple of decades ago, after you have this kind of more left progressive kind of moving that you see is taking place also in other countries in Latin America again, but in particular in Venezuela, since other allies are also kind of going away. So I mean, or kind of, changing sides or politically, economically. So is Venezuela kind of adapting similar ideologies or political or economic methods than Cuba, for example? Okay, yeah, that would be the second question.
And we've also got a question by, is it Moz Greenshields? Is it Bill? You got your hand up, Bill.
Yeah, you want to take it now? It was just the first question really got me thinking. And the question was, would we want to live in that state? I just want to ask, would the 65,000 people dead of COVID in Britain prefer to live in Cuba, where they don't have the deaths? With the people on the food banks and on the handouts because they're living in poverty in Britain prefer to live in Cuba? With the 5 or 6 million unemployed there's going to be by Christmas in Britain, prefer to live in Cuba? So they're my questions. I think probably I know the answers. I don't think it's an academic debate. I don't think we're here to make points off each other. Cuba's a shining example to Latin America. When we took a trip to Cuba from Derby a few years ago, and I believe the pediatrician who came with us is at this meeting, Dr. Imti Chunara. He saw a health system for children, and particularly trauma in terms of children, that he thinks that the European doctors could learn from, and established a link with them. And we took teachers from special schools in Britain who said that the kids in Cuban special schools wouldn't be in school at all in most Latin American countries, and they are treated with respect. When kids leave school in Britain with those kinds of disabilities, many of them are unemployed and kept in institutions. In Cuba, they make room for them, they make jobs for them. The kids are treated with respect. So with respect, I think that the first questioner came to make her point. She's anti-Cuba, pro-imperialist. She made a point. I'd like to thank you very much for organising the meeting.
Can I hand it over to you, Helen, at this point?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, because I'll get lost otherwise. So let me deal with I'll deal with the Laura Bill issue in a minute, if you don't mind, which is not really a Laura and Bill issue, but expressed by them. Has the revolution become more institutionalized since the Constitution? Well, the revolution has been institutionalized, really. Historians of Cuba talk about it from the 1970s, but the institutions are changing. Actually, it's a feature of the Cuban state that it has been in a lot of flux. It changes quite a bit. There's been a fair bit of experimentation. I think probably the most significant development in institutional terms introduced with the new constitution is a process of decentralization of in financial and terms and sort of public policy. So there is a definite move towards promoting local development. And this is really interesting because it dovetails with something that I didn't mention. It was on the final slide, final slides I couldn't show. It dovetails with the what's called the life task, Tarea Vida in Cuba, this 100-year state plan to combat climate change. And what the Cubans have realized, in a sense, or what they have concluded, shall I say, is that that they are facing an existential threat from climate change. Yeah, I mean, you just see that from the fact that it's a low-lying island, and just look at the rate of the incursions by the sea that's predicted, the salination of water, underwater supplies, and so on. And so to combat, in the process, they're doing these two processes together. One, decentralizing local authority and budgets and so on for local development, but also building into that model from the beginning a model of sustainable development. It's a very interesting process which is just initiating, and obviously everything has been interrupted to an extent by the pandemic, but it is something that I will be I'm moving on hopefully to research, so I'll be able to talk about that a little bit more. I don't know if that answers your question in terms of the constitution, Frederick, more or less. Yeah. Okay. So Venezuela I think the situation in Venezuela is very different. In what year was it? In 2000 and just after Chavez died, I was invited to Venezuela to go and work with a vice ministry of the communal economy. And I was invited on the basis of my book about Che Guevara's economic management system, the budgetary finance system. And they said, oh, we want to see what we can learn from this. But it seemed to me, I mean, I sort of turned up there saying there are no relevant lessons, because if you look at Cuba, within 2 years of the revolution, 86% of industry was in state hands, 100% of financial institutions were in state hands, 70% of agriculture, and so on. And so it was possible to have a state-managed economic management system that would direct development. And the situation in Venezuela has never even approached that. If you look at the proportion of financial institutions that remain in private hands, if you look at the fact that there is no state monopoly on imports and exports, on trade, then they have this problem of the problem of capital flight, of the importation of empty boxes, of the hoarding, and all these things. So I think that the Venezuelan economy is very different from Cuba, and only in the sort of broadest terms could we draw some parallels. And what is clear is that Venezuela, like Cuba, is currently suffering a great deal from the impact of US sanctions, and that again reflects the historical development challenge, being an economy dominated by mono products, in the case of Venezuela, oil, being economy dominated by trade with the United States, and those sorts of broad features. But Venezuela is struggling hard under the impact of US sanctions. I don't know, I hope that's sort of dealt with that question. On the question of, George's question, I think that I spoke in a meeting with the Cuban ambassador to the UK just on Thursday night, and she was talking about the increased pressure from the Trump administration through the sanctions, and she said very clearly, we know that these are designed to create discontent. I mean, that was always the original intention of the blockade. It was articulated in documents that are now public, but to create in this context now a social explosion. And I think that it's very difficult for, I think there is concern about that prospect. The world has changed. The other element that's there is social media. Cubans are connected. Cuba is isolated. They haven't had something like the battle of ideas since that basically came to end around 2009, 2010, which sort of gives that whole section of youth a new meaning, a new purpose, a sort of protagonism within the revolution. Perhaps this will come out of the COVID-19 pandemic. Perhaps it will come with the urgent need to combat climate change. There is an animal rights movement in Cuba. There is all sorts of things. But I think clearly there is an issue of youth engagement with the revolution. And it's just, you can just see, you know, Cubans who remain committed to the revolution, fighting back through social media, fighting back through various ways and so on. Just to be clear, for Laura's sake, in my book, I explain that when I talk about the revolutionary people, I'm not talking just about party militants. I'm talking about people who pulled together to pull through the special period, people who grew vegetables for their neighbours, people who maybe were prostitutes and then, you know, worked with the Women's Federation to find alternative employment, people who were working illegally, but then took out licenses to work informally. So it's not this sort of, you know, hierarchical dogmatic concept of revolutionary people. It's just the people who have, you know, stuck at it, stuck with it, and got on with the art of living in very, very difficult circumstances. I think I would like, you know, I went to university and I started reading about Cuba in English language texts, and, you know, it was the Cubanology paradigm. And the Cubanology paradigm, I don't shy away from the issues that you raised. I address them very clearly, but what I don't do is pretend that they are somehow truths. Yeah, we have to be clear that this is all deeply political. And there is a set of key tenets of Cubanology. I'm going to read this from my book, that the revolution of 1959 represented a rupture, that Fidel and Raúl have personally dominated domestic and foreign policy since, denying Cuban democracy and repressing civil society. Thanks to their mismanagement of the economy, growth since 1959 has been negligible. They simply replaced pre-revolutionary dependency on the United States, dependence on the Soviet Union until its collapse in 1991, and subsequently on Venezuela. These ideas have shaped international, political, and media discourse. But I go on to explain why this is a caricature that is problematic. It obstructs our ability to see clearly what goes on in Cuba, and by depicting the Cuban people as an amorphous and pacified mass, it fails to account for the revolution's endurance and achievement. Second, this is premised on neoclassical economic assumptions, which entails abstraction and negation of history and path dependence. By stressing economic policy over economic restraints, critics have shifted responsibility for Cuba's poverty onto the Castros without implicating successive US administrations that have imposed the suffocating US blockade. Now, that doesn't mean that there haven't been elements of Cuban policy that have been criticized. But, you know, what's really interesting in the chapter on rectification, I quote Fidel Castro being harshly critical of the revolution itself, and the same kind of criticisms arise again in the Battle of Ideas. So there is a notion from outside Cuba that you have this sort of, you know, Fidel is the revolution, and his, you know, I spent years reading and feeling that it was an unsatisfactory explanation that the Cuban Revolution could be understood by the biological state or the psychological state of Fidel Castro. You know, the idea that he only, the reason I did that whole thing about the challenge of development was to make this point. The idea that he turned to communism because he wanted to win a battle with rivals in Cuba, and he thought if he could get this. No, I just think all of this is analytically weak and doesn't help us to understand what happens in Cuba, and that's what I was trying to do. So yes, this is an imminent critique. Yes, I am accepting the objectives and premises of what the revolution has set out to do, and I'm exploring by removing those ideological sort of restraints that force me to denounce human rights violations before I could talk about Cuban biotechnology, or before I could talk about sustainable development. You know, I have been able to tell a story that the feedback from people is they're finding very informative and enriching. I mean, you know, the other stuff, you can go to all sorts of official and mainstream and dominant paradigms to read these condemnations of Cuba, which I don't think are, they're often just politically motivated.
I believe, Andreas, you've got a couple of questions in the chat, have you?
Yes, thanks a lot, Oliver. Here are a couple of questions from the chat, Helen. I think the two, they relate quite nicely together. So Yakini Goddard asked, how much support does the Cuban government have amongst the general population? And that's followed up with a question by Julia Eder. I'm just going down in the chat to make sure. Yeah, here I've got it, who said that she had been to Cuba, but her impression was that the support for the revolution among the younger generations was lower, particularly those who grew up during this special period, and that there was also some consumerist ideology present. And the question is, have you made similar observation, or would you say it is no question of age at all? So the general support by the people for the Cuban system, but also what about the younger generation in this respect?
Okay, so this might be an unpopular thing to say, but if you go to Cuba as a visitor and you're clearly there as a visitor, you know, the kind of dialogues you're going to have are going to be different from if you live with a Cuban family. I mean, that's clear, right? There's also an incentive for people to come up and talk to you and the things they say. And you can also change the rhetoric very quickly. If someone comes up to you and they say, oh, you know, I'll show you around old Havana, give me some money, oh, I hate this, you know, dictatorship, blah, blah, blah. If you say, oh, I'm here in solidarity, they could just literally change the rhetoric. So I think that I've already underlined there is an issue with youth engagement. But you know that woman who I quoted at the beginning of the presentation, Isabel Allende, I asked her that question when I interviewed her at the Higher Institute of International Relations. They have students, right? That's what they do, as well as training diplomats. And she said, you know, if you'd asked, when I interviewed her, it was, let me think, it was like the 1st of January 2017. So not long after Fidel Castro had died. And she said to me, if you'd asked me this 2 years ago, my answer would have been very, I would have been a little bit demoralized about the state of the young people. And she said, but actually, I'm quite content now. I feel reassured. And I said, why? She said, because after the death of Fidel Castro, the young people mobilized. She said, students of ours who've never been politically active, never been, you know, they mobilized, everyone would show respect. They were going around telling people to, you know, don't turn off the music and whatever. And they went out onto the streets to show respect. And they just, it was like, you know, as I was saying, that there hasn't been that test, that calling, that moment. But when something came up, she was saying she felt reassured by their reaction. And shortly after that, I think a year after that, there was a terrible tornado in Havana, out of the blue. Cubans don't normally get hit by tornadoes, and 50-something houses were flattened and many destroyed. And young people mobilized all around the island to help to reinforce the state's response to get assistance to people. So, you know, I think there is an issue. Where is there not an issue with engagement versus alienation among the youth population? Where is there not an issue? I certainly used to love being in Cuba and not having access to social media, because actually there was so much more, you know, communication and vibrancy. And now you see the same as you see in Glasgow city centre, where I went yesterday, right? You see the same in Havana. People are sitting around, they're walking along with friends, not talking to each other. They're all doing their tweets, messages. So clearly there are those issues, but where are they not? We just have to see. There is one thing to say, you know, I want more opportunity, I want more money to buy more closed, I want more leisure. And it's another thing to say, I accept the restoration of capitalism, or I will move against my government. There's a massive gulf between those two positions, I'd say.
Well, thank you very much for that. I believe we have time for just one more question. If anyone would like to go ahead. Do we have any in chat, any more in chat, Andreas?
Yes, there's another question in the chat, and I think it's good in the sense that it draws attention to a different area. So if I could bring that up, Oliver. So Helen Styliane Filippo asked your comments on the current legislation related to the rights of workers employed in the fast-growing private economy, salary, vacations, maternity rights, etc., as well as on the relation between the legal rights of these workers and those of the workers employed by the Cuban state. Can you comment, please, on the extent to which workers in the private sector are or are not legally employed, registered by their employers, and what measures the state takes to protect the increasing number of these workers? So it's about labor relations in this private sector.
Yeah. Okay, so I go into this a lot in my book, actually. First of all, in the chapter on the reforms that were brought in, but also in the chapter on the tightrope. Formally, workers in the non-state sector are well protected. There are limits on how long they can work. They have to be paid twice the local average of the state salary. Their employer has to pay social security, etc., etc. The problem is, of course, in the informality that happens. So people whose labour is not declared, it's not registered, there are no contracts, and people who are working maybe 2 or 3 jobs. So there were. I cite this investigation done by Cuban social scientists, which looks at the shoe making industry sector in Cuba, which is in majority in private hands, and the proportion of workers who were in that sector but were being declared by their employees was very low. It's in my book. I can't remember the exact proportion. And then the proportion of those in that sector as well, who were what they call contracted workers, so they were employed by the private interest, who were in the trade union, was also very low. I then discussed this with the trade, one of the heads of the trade union, and he recognized it was a problem. And then I spoke to another social scientist in Cuba who said, I don't think they're doing enough. People are allowing themselves to be in exploitative working conditions because they want more cash. And how does the state get a grip on it? So it's an issue that I've discussed at length in my book. I would just like to say that I hope you will be inspired to get a copy of my book. As I said, my book was a COVID baby. It was impacted by the pandemic. So that was that question. I also want to let you all know, because we haven't really talked about the COVID, Cuba's quite outstanding response to COVID-19. I'm making a documentary with a group of other people. I'm really excited about it. I'm also really nervous because it has to be finished by the 11th of November. And if I can just, I'll tell you what I'll do is I'll just share the link to the registration. It's free. We've interviewed some of the top people in Cuba in the biotech sector that I was talking about. And we have also interviewed a family doctor and one of the 28,000 medical students who, as the universities were closed, were enrolled to work with the family doctors to go door to door every day to track down people with COVID-19 symptoms and so on. So I'll share that in the chat now, and I don't know whether you want to take any more questions or how we're doing for time.
We're just out of time now, but I'd like to give a big thank you to Helen for an engaging talk covering a lot of themes in terms to do with the resilience of the Cuban Revolution. One thing I can say about We Are Cuba, Helen's latest book, is it's similar to the Che Guevara book, and it touches a topic that had been it hadn't been covered to any serious extent. And so in that sense, it's a book that we can really, learn from and take a lot of lessons from. So I encourage people to go out and not just read We Are Cuba, but also take a look at Che Guevara, The Economics of Revolution, because that was also a very pioneering book based on hundreds of interviews inside Cuba. So I'd like to thank Helen on behalf of the CSSGJ for giving this talk today. Before we go, we've got another couple of talks coming up over the next month, 2 more talks this semester. We've got one looking at ethical green energy and whether there's the prospect for an ethical green publicly owned energy company, and that's on the 16th of November. It's given by a local councillor here in Nottingham. We don't just hear this is CSSG, we also like to include community campaigners as well as academics and activists, and that will also be at 6 p.m. on a Monday. And then at the end of the month, on the 30th of November, we've got a talk looking at decolonizing the curriculum. And this will be given by Professor Raju from the University of York in Canada. So that also proves to be a very good one. So I'm very appreciative of Helen to come here today to give a talk, well-attended talk, and we're very pleased that so many people turned up. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you, and yeah, just drop me an email if you want to. I hope you managed to get a copy of my book in your hands. Let me know what you think. And enjoy Ecuador and the hot sun, Oliver.
Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you soon.
Yeah,
Bye.
definitely. Bye-bye.